Greetings! In this presentation I will discuss the lesson plan I made for my BO4A assignment. This task was not chosen by my placement school due to recent events. Thus, I opted for a task originating from the workbook New Interface A for 1 VMBO KGT. In this task, the students have to make an interview, record the interview, and then they have to send the interview to the teacher. The interview is about a fictional movie star who is interviewed, and the students have to fill the roles of interviewer and interviewee. After the task has been recorded, the students are to review the interview at least 3 times to fill the looking back section of the assignment. Finally, the students have to report back to the teacher in order to report instances of language they had trouble with, so the teacher can complete the task cycle of Willis and Willis by designing a lesson which contains a practice phase. If we analyze the chosen task, we will come to the following conclusions. This task holds the interests of students, as celebrities and movies tend to be followed by some students. It is unreasonable to assume that all students hold a particular celebrity in mind. It is as unreasonable to assume that students have never seen a movie with a celebrity in it. It may pique certain students' interest to find out that they will fill the role of their favorite celebrity being interviewed. While this does step away from the real world, students may in the future need to, for example, have a job interview or conduct a job interview in English. Therefore, I would argue that this task does indeed reflect part of the real-world experience the students may have. The task is not specifically about form, rather to get a message across. Willis and Willis from 2007 states that when an assignment puts communication first, it has meaning as its primary function. The assignment does not recommend a base form for the students to work off. A product has to be delivered to the teacher in order for the students to pass this assignment. A successful interview is a prerequisite for this assignment to be passed, making its completion a priority. Due to the strict time limits of the lesson, the students are encouraged to work at a steady pace. As I stated before, this task does fit the interest of the students. Celebrities are relevant in the eyes of the students, and some like talking about them. Writing out the interview, which has to be held, is forbidden in the assignment, so a real conversation has to be held. This promotes function over form, because the students have to respond in the moment and cannot plan every word spoken. Parts of the interview have to be planned, but the interview in its entirety cannot be written out. The work form itself builds upon the next phase of the task cycle in a straightforward fashion. The use of ICT in this task is through the use of students' phone cameras to film the interviews. The students' phones are also used to review the interviews and to send it to the teacher. Because the students can pull from every piece of English language they have learned thus far, we could consider this a typeful learning activity. In typeful learning activities, the students have to use the knowledge they have gathered up to that point in a creative way, according to Evans and Didactical from 2015. This assignment encourages a creative approach as there is no template for the students to work off other than that the students will have to produce 5 questions and answers. The example interview that the students will be shown can hardly be called a template, as the students will only view it once. The example interview also serves to set expectations for the students so they know what could be expected of the interview. The lesson can be seen through the model of Willis and Willis from 2007. We start the pre-task phase with a discussion about interviews the student and the teacher have seen in the past. But the pre-task presents itself mainly in the viewing of the example interview, giving the students an idea of what to expect for the end product. While the end product the students will be making is not expected to be as robust as the interview shown to them, showing the students such an interview does put ideas into their heads about what their end product could look like. The example interview will be accessible in one of the appendices. The task entails the making of the interview. Students have to write out questions as well as establish the personalities partaking in the interview. The planning phase consists of the students practicing the interview before they record the interview. After they are done practicing, they are to record the interview, for it will be sent later to the teacher. The questions and answers cannot be written out in its entirety, as that goes against the communicative approach. Establishing personalities for the interview could make the answers given more unpredictable. So, the interviewer also needs to actively pay attention instead of listing questions off of a list. The report phase comes in when the students have to hand in their interview through the school's email system. After the students handed in their interview, they are to watch their interview at least 3 times before they are to start the analysis of their interviews on page 172 of the workbook. By making looking back on page 172 of the workbook, the students reflect on the task they have made. They will most likely notice small mistakes or points of improvement while looking back at the interview. Once the students have completed looking back, the students have to report aspects they found hard while making the interview. I expect the pronunciation of words or words that they have used to be reported. The final practice phase of the task cycle consists of a future lesson. After the students have reported their points of improvement, it is up to the teacher to build upon those points by making a new lesson. By the end of the lesson, the students can make an interview about a guided subject in English. The students also can, by the end of the interview, answer interview questions in English. Peerfeedback was given to me by Jim Meinders and Arash Kardi, 2 HVA students from the same class as me. The feedback from Jim Meinders is largely positive. Looking deeper into the feedback given, there is one glaring point in my lesson which he has resolved by splitting the lessons up into multiple lessons. Jim criticizes my lesson plan for having a very tight schedule. One solution is also mentioned. In a prior lesson, duos can already be made. That would shift the task cycle from Willis and Willis, where part of the pre-task has been set up in a prior lesson. This would free up part of the lesson, so more time could be given for students to, for example, make personalities for the interviewee or interviewer, to think of questions or answers, or to make several attempts at making the video. Arash Kardi had more points of critique regarding my lesson plan. Arash argued that interviews are not relevant to the student world, as interviews are more for celebrities than for regular people. While it is true that celebrities are far more susceptible to being formally interviewed in a way the book describes than regular people, it should also be noted that interviews can come in a wide variety of ways. A job interview is one example of a type of interview the students will come into contact with. Informal types of interviews, like interviews with foreign friends, are also examples of interviews students may come into contact with in the future. Lastly, Arash mentions that the use of ICT is fitting with the students, but he also argues that the use of ICT could cause some problems with certain students who may not want to record an interview and or send it to the teacher. This is a good point, as students could become very anxious if the right learning conditions are not met, according to Emmett and Etkova from 2015. By looking back at the feedback and putting it once again, fitting it into the material analysis, we can see that outside perspective brought some light to overlooked flaws in the lesson plan. Jim argues that I am cramping too much into one lesson, whereas Arash overlooks the aspect of time management of the lesson. Arash, however, points out that the assignment may not be reflective of the experiences students may have in the future. Jim looks over this point and has nothing to say about it. When looking at the lesson planning, both Arash and Jim have no problems with it. Both Arash and Jim mention that the phases build upon each other, and Jim also mentions that the students are stimulated to keep working. While Jim has no further comment on the ICT work, Arash expands his argument by giving examples of why the use of ICT may not be appropriate. The feedback given to me can form the basis of points of improvements that have to be met by the end of year 3. Based on the feedback I have received from Arash and Jim, I have concluded that my lessons have some major flaws, which have to be addressed and have to be corrected by the end of year 3. I would argue that my main point of improvement for year 3 is definitely time management. I have to get better at judging what I can do in a lesson. Relating better to the world of the students is also a very good point, as the more interested and involved the students are with the lesson, the more effective the lessons will be. Thank you for listening to my presentation about the lesson plan for BO4A. Thanks to making this assignment, I have a better idea of what I need to focus on in year 3.